hear
just
you.
a few things before we start. Thank you, Rory, for waiting patiently. Espan was having some issues in terms of joining vMix that Rory was privy to in the backstage. So we've asked Espan to record his presentation, and we'll put that out during the break so he can keep on track. So Rory, without further ado, thank you very much, and the floor is all yours.
Yeah, thanks, Cameron. What's up, everyone? I'm Dr. Rory Summerley, and I'm back again with another paper on esports institutions. So I'll just transfer over to my slides. Cool. So my presentation today is Esports Hit the Big Time. What organizational and reputational problems face esports in the context of authoritarian capitalist investment and sporting mega events? So let's get into it. There we go. So originally this piece was going to be about the Olympic Esports Games 2027, which was due to happen a couple of years from now, but has unfortunately been cancelled. And so I've had to pivot quite a lot with this research project, but there is still interesting stuff to be discussed. The reason that we're kind of looking at Olympic esports to begin with was because the Olympic Committee was kind of noticing a decline in popularity with the youth and pursuing options to regain it. So esports was one method to do that. The Olympic Esports Games were originally going to be exclusively hosted by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, or KSA, which itself has its own goals in terms of managing its own reputation, and it's doing so with a number of entertainment and sports event acquisitions, which have been criticized as sports washing. Informally, esports as a whole, as a big amorphous blob, has had a bit of a long-term goal of legitimation in the mainstream, often via the Olympics, which is kind of highlighted as one day we will get there. So what to make of all of this that's happening? Well, there's several problems or research questions raised by these things that are happening within esports. The problems as they exist are to do with the choice of esports played, which is more of an organizational problem. But then there are two reputational problems that kind of stem from this stuff that's happening. One concerns the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and authoritarian capitalism investing in esports generally. And the other is to do more with the global reputation of esports, though the International Olympic Committee will come up a lot here as well, just because of the nature of the case study. In terms of methodology, I am mainly practicing a sort of analysis of case studies, as well as their related stakeholders and events leading up to what was going to be the Olympic Esports Games 2027. This is going to be informed by some reputation theory and looking at public reception so far, as well as the intersection of international relations and authoritarian capitalist investment in sports, and I guess esports more specifically. The supporting case studies, since the Esports Games 2027 isn't really happening anymore, are going to be a mixture of things, including the Esports World Cup, the Esports Nation Cup 2026, which is going to be a Saudi Arabian event, Olympic Games of recent decades, as well as the Olympic Virtual Series and Olympic Esports Week. I'll also be looking at a variety of different documentation, reporting, community response, and so on of the above. So let's start with the choice of esports played. What considerations behind the choice of games played at sporting mega events are there, and what do they reveal? Well, to begin with, the conversation is quite tricky because there are a large number of esports, but we often kind of talk about them as if they are a sort of single monolith as such. So the colloquial discussion of them sometimes means that things get a bit muddied. And even within academic discussions, this is a little bit, blurring the boundaries sometimes about what is or isn't included. And this is quite a key question for much larger organizations such as the Olympics in terms of what is or is not included and how it is included. Without the participation of federations and associations for esports, or maybe even specific individual games, or the relevant developer publisher, these events aren't really possible. And so the relationships between these different stakeholders kind of show what's happening behind the scenes in terms of the choice of games played. And before it was cancelled, the International Olympic Committee proposed three types of esports, a three-ring circus, if you will. You have physical sports games, electronic or simulated sports games, as well as traditional or core esports, that last one being the one that we usually think of. Esports Nations Cup seems not to involve these former two categories, not latter two categories. Not really looking at sort of virtual sports, simulated sports, only looking at sort of video games played competitively. But let's look at differences in selection and criteria amongst the different events. First, we have the 2021 Olympic Virtual Series, which just had a few sporting categories that were aligned to a corresponding esport. The only one that stands out here possibly is rowing, which didn't have a specific game associated with it, but did encourage participants to share rowing data online from a home exercise machine. The others did actually kind of feature a esport of a kind, one that is played competitively by a community on a regular basis. We also note when we turn to the 2023 Olympic Esports Week, we see the same thing happening as a strategy. The Olympics are trying to kind of align sporting categories with a corresponding esport. In some cases, the sporting category doesn't actually exist as an Olympic event, such as motorsport. But the notable categories here are ones where there is not really a competitive scene as such as Just Dance, or cases where the organization is arguably corrupt. The two prominent ones here being tic-tac-toe and virtual taekwondo. The reason this claim has been made was because there were clearly connections between the developers of the games and the Singaporean organization lead. Tic-tac-toe was announced as an Olympic event before it was even released, before there was even a competitive community, and there was no prior series to sort of build a community off of. And so very quickly people had to become competitively up to date with tic-tac-toe. Which itself only lasted about 1.5 years and is now dead. You cannot play it anymore. And so it's very clear that it was probably included due to the overlap in terms of who was organizing the events and who had a business interest in doing that. This is unfortunately nothing new for sport, but esports' lack of regulatory frameworks and weak representative institutions, such as federations and associations for esports, means that it may more often than not affect game selection in cases where a mega event is not taking it over themselves. In the case of the Olympic Esports Week, it was determined by the Singaporean organization. Turning to the 2026 Esports World Cup, which has not yet happened, but previous Esports World Cups have very similar game selections. We can note again there may be a few exceptions. Most of the esports being played are well known and have had competitive communities for a while. But there are some interesting exceptions. Chess.com is probably an interesting one, debatable as to whether it is or is not an esport. But the two I'll highlight for now are EA Sports FC26 and Fatal Fury City of the Wolves, both of which are currently kind of directly owned by Saudi Arabia, or at least have kind of a controlling stake from a relevant investment fund within Saudi Arabia. And so the game selection becomes kind of a question of kind of business interests as well as what makes for a good event. Turning to the Olympics again, looking at the actual selection criteria for esports is interesting because it is not really very formalized. There are many reports of compliance with the Olympic Charter as being one of the more determining factors, primarily non-violence or non-sexualized representations of human action. So quite a lot of traditional esports are excluded by this criteria specifically for violence. So content alignment with an existing traditional sport is also the case, but obviously not every esport is built off of an existing sport, and so aligning with a traditional sport is not always possible. Host city partnership also determines the choice of games, as it did in the case with Singapore. And the business and promotional partnership may also be a consideration in the case where Singapore chose games where there was a key link between organizational committee members and developers of one of the esports. The popularity of a game is also worth considering, and is probably why Fortnite remained the only example of a shooting game that was included in the Olympics, albeit with caveats. And so popularity does somewhat override some of these criteria. I'm not going to go through everything with regards to traditional Olympic criteria now, but there are some interesting differences. The main one just being generally that the regular Olympic Games criteria are much more stringent. I'll highlight a few. It must be in compliant with the World Anti-Doping Code and the Olympic Movement Code on the Prevention of the Manipulation of Competition. The Sports International Federation, if it exists, must apply for admittance by filing a petition establishing its criteria of eligibility to the International Olympic Committee. Another one is that the Olympic Charter indicates that in order to be accepted, a sport must be widely practiced by men in at least 75 countries and on 4 continents, and by women in no fewer than 40 countries and on 3 continents. All of these specific criteria are seemingly not really the case for esports, or weren't for the Olympic Esports Games, as far as we know. Practically, there's good reasons why these might not be the case, but it is interesting to note that there are completely different values at play, even if the Olympic Charter is cited as a major one. Turning to the Esports World Cup Foundation's selection criteria for the World Cup and other events, such as the Nations Cup 2026, Taylor Hill reports that there are 3 primary factors that decide whether a game gets selected or not. They are simply performance, in terms of viewership and attendance, existing ecosystem, so the longevity of the sport, the number of people playing it, and the scope of tournaments, and publisher support, so direct strength of support with a publishing partner, i.e. the developer-publisher of the game. So it's fairly straightforward, and it's probably more aligned to what people would normally consider to be a sensible approach in terms of esports event organization. But partners also indicate likely selections for future games. So coming up next year, partners for this event, the Nations Cup 2026, will be EA, Krafton, Tencent, and Ubisoft. So presumably, those developer publishers will be involved to some extent in game selection. It's a big contrast with the Olympics, but does still present some problems. So let's talk about the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and authoritarian capitalism. The research question here is, how will the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia's capital investment affect the global participation, motivations, and decisions of esports stakeholders regarding upcoming events? Now, authoritarianism and games are not anything new. Things have happened before in terms of authoritarian investment in large international sporting and gaming events before. So Saudi Arabia are not exceptional to this criticism. Many states are problematic, and I do not wish to suggest there is an exception here. Even aside from authoritarianism, there are many other ways in which various states conflict or are not completely compatible with Olympic values. The world is not ideal. So we're not kind of highlighting this as kind of like something unusual or freakish. So what leads to Saudi Arabia being the focal case study, other than the fact that they were originally involved in the plans for the Olympic Esports Games? They are quite distinct in the sense that there's a bunch of things happening with Saudi Arabia that make them worth examining from the perspective of international esports or large-scale investment in them. Currently, as far as I can tell, capital investment in esports by a single nation is unrivaled compared to Saudi Arabia. Even South Korea does not spend as much currently on an annual basis as Saudi Arabia is currently. Esports are seen positively by Saudi Arabia in the framework of their own kind of strategies for future growth, whereas other countries may see esports on a national scale as less significant, marginal, or even taboo. Foreign policy in Saudi Arabia partially depends on esports, although not entirely. There's also an interesting contrast of values between the Saudi nation-state and the values of esports communities, which is felt sharply at the moment between the people who play and organize events for those games, across the world, and with the nation-state of Saudi Arabia. There's also the problem that is posed by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia's national or corporate involvement in the games industry, which we'll go into in a moment. Inevitably, some of these things create discord or controversy, and they should be examined just to see kind of what the future is likely to be with esports, given that there is so much capital being invested. So, Saudi Arabia has quite a large number of corporate ownership or investment in various games companies or esports companies. Some of them are just minor stakes, others are controlling stakes entirely. So some of these suggest that Saudi Arabia is in a good position to put forward its own games, essentially, in terms of corporate ownership forward, or to potentially monopolize certain corners of the market to essentially kind of develop an event that makes more profit and prestige for itself. This is not the worst thing in the world, but it's already somewhat problematic that you have corporate ownership of esports to begin with. Mixing in national ownership via corporate ownership of an esport is very interesting because it suggests that the future of that game may be entirely determined by the values of that nation in some ways. It's not often invoked, but a developer publisher can refuse certain events being held for their game. The primary example would be someone like Nintendo. So potentially there's a lot of power in the hands of Saudi Arabia as they sort of acquire more. There's also the probably more commonly brought up example of values difference between Saudi Arabia as a nation state and esports communities around the world. One of the things that was put forward as a benefit by the Olympic Esports Games was the diversity that esports engenders. So by promoting the fact that esports does not require sex-based testing, this actually doesn't really gel well with KSA's ideology, and it cannot be done without irony. In fact, the dissolution of the Olympic Esports Games seemed to come about partially because the Saudi contingent did not like what was being suggested in terms of values by the Olympic Committee. One of the stated reasons was the fact that women were in leadership positions, which is, fairly minor in my mind, but obviously there are cultural differences. There's also a division in various esports communities, I should say, well, sports communities as well, of those who are willing to accept what some term as blood money in terms of being sort of less pleased about having to collaborate with Saudi Arabia, given some of the things they are accused of. And so this kind of is creating a bit of a split in the community in terms of whether someone is willing to take economic capital and leave aside their values. That brings us to the final section, which is the global reputation of esports. How will esports' presence in authoritarian capitalist investment portfolios and at sporting mega events affect the global reputation of esports? So there are two things here that are happening with the Olympic Committee and Saudi Arabia, which I think are interesting to look at as symptomatic of broader trends within esports. So there's always been this kind of undertone, I would say. It's not exactly formally stated by many people, but there is this kind of thing of one day esports will become this big mainstream success. When that day comes, we will say, we are finally at the Olympics, or we finally have serious money invested by someone other than the games industry. Finally, esports is taken seriously. But there is a kind of be careful what you wish for happening here. Because of the fallout of the Olympic Esports Games, there's an interesting split happening between these two titans of industry. So the Saudi interest in esports is partially due to efforts to do what has been accused of sports washing, whereas the Olympics is interested similarly in capturing a new audience, being down with the kids, so to speak. However, there is a criticism that you could put forward that the Olympics are unfamiliar with esports, and Saudi Arabia are not particularly flexible with regards to values. And so after the Olympic Esports Games collapsed, there's a bit of a divergence in how the future of large-scale investment in mainstream esports events could go. You have the Olympic model, which could be considered palatable, but incompetent, in the sense that it seems to not really gel with what esports generally does. Whereas the Saudi model is the opposite. It is unpalatable, but competent. There is a lot of investment happening, and they have got good practice in terms of running large-scale events well, but the values concern is too much for some people. Turning to reputation theory, I have to consider here what is the reputational impact on different people. And at this stage, I'm only really thinking about what I'm broadly calling the esports enthusiast, someone who is familiar with the scene, versus the layperson. We could maybe diversify the esports enthusiast into different stakeholders, but there is a mixture of potentially poor or good reputational problems that might be happening when we're looking at their perspective on the reputation of the Olympics or Saudi Arabia. The esports enthusiast, as I've mentioned, is probably going to say that the Olympics is reputationally good, but not very good at organization, whereas Saudi Arabia is the opposite. Whereas a layperson is an interesting one to think about in terms of esports, hitting the big time, so to speak. Lay people will probably say that the Olympics seems to have a decent reputation and is generally a significant event. Saudi Arabia is obviously understood generally to be a well-funded organization as a nation state, but again, its reputation is still somewhat divisive, even because of sort of mainstream press reporting about the country. Unfortunately, in all of this, the risk, if it can be called that, is that the reputation of esports becomes a sort of sideshow to this main event. The Olympics' bread and butter is sports. esports, if it's included eventually in a sort of more formal fashion, may risk becoming just a sideshow, kind of like a freak show, in the same way that the same might happen for Saudi Arabia in terms of it being kind of a means to an end. It becomes a freak novelty that does not elevate its subject and is often associated with human rights indignities, much like sideshows of the Victorian era and early 20th century were. So the conclusions are ongoing. I don't have any kind of firm answers, as this research is a piece of work in progress. But I hope for the people watching, it's provided interesting discussion going forward. And I'd be curious to see if there are any questions. And here are my references.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Rory. So unfortunately, I don't have any questions in chat, but I do think it's important that we discuss sports washing, especially at the moment, in terms of what we see within esports, but also in traditional sports. And I like the fact you linked it back to that quite heavily. One of the things that I do want to talk about in relation to sports washing, I would assume in relation to Saudi Arabia in particular, is the different approach that they have been able to do within esports in comparison to traditional sports, mostly football, right? So this is a question in relation to that in terms of an ethical point of view. We can start seeing quite a few Saudi Arabian professional esports players come onto the scene and be quite dominant in terms of the world performance. Do you think that we'll see this in relation to the Saudi Arabia moving forward in terms of traditional sports as well? Or do you think it's just because the market for esports is significantly smaller that we are going to be able to see them catch up a little bit quicker?
It's an interesting question. I'll try and condense my answer, I guess. I think in Saudi Arabia, there is a fairly decent amount of support and market for esports themselves, like they are played widely. I think the challenge with traditional sports is that they are only just about starting investment in the long term. Like women's sports, for instance, were only recently invested in. I think around 2012 was when they were first allowing Olympic participants from women's sports. And so I think they are just doing their best to grow it, again, to try and change a lot of the more sordid aspects of their reputation generally. So it's probably something that will happen over time, I imagine. But it also kind of depends on the country. Every country is different in terms of the sports that make up its most popular games, right? Not every country has a lot of professionals who play every single sport or even every single esport. And that kind of phenomenon is usually determined a little bit by the characteristics of the nation. So in the case of esports, it would be access to those games, whether there's regular community events, and so on. With regards to sports, I think the investment is much harder because you have to have the facilities and the access to those things, such as stadium, the equipment needed to play, clubs and communities that will regularly encourage people to do that sort of thing. So it really depends on kind of where the investment will be going, I think, before you see really major changes happening amongst, like, say, younger up-and-coming players, if that makes sense.
Perfect. No, that's a really good answer, and it's quite apparent in terms of the distribution. There's one more question in relation to it, and I'll let you decide if you want to answer it and how you want to answer it, actually, because it's sports washing one, so you can go into multiple ways. Do you think that sports washing actually works? Firstly, I think it's the one thing in relation to it. And do you think that what the KSA, Saudi Arabia, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is doing is palatable to the larger audience in relation to sports washing?
Whether or not it works is an interesting question. I think capital speaks very loudly, and that is their strength in terms of being able to kind of persuade people, for lack of a better term. I think they are somewhat unopposed. If you look at every other nation currently, I don't think there are as many that would be investing in the same way. What I mean by that is more just that for Saudi Arabia, it seems to be a matter of survival because they are relying kind of on a petroleum-based industry for most of their profit. And so they have to pivot to something else. And they've chosen basically entertainment and sport to pivot into. So for them, it's kind of a survival strategy. So it's kind of, it has to work a little bit for them. Whether it will or not, I think, depends on the values of other people and their partners. It's possible that they could partner with any number of countries around the world that don't really mind too much being partners with authoritarian regimes, which we see, lots of examples of. So I don't see there's any reason why it would be a complete failure. However, because what they're investing in is associated with certain values, I think that is a challenge that is, I guess, mostly a public relations challenge, which is why I'm kind of focusing on reputation theory. I think for the general public, it's hard to say globally, but if you ask the general public what they know of Saudi Arabia, at least in the UK, which is where I'm based, it doesn't have a great reputation, primarily because of various human rights issues that exist within its legal system. So it really depends. A global perspective on Saudi Arabia may be more forgiving. Like I say, not every nation state is perfect, and there are plenty of authoritarian states. So it's really hard to say in the long run. I think you'd have to look at, or what I'm hoping to do is look at the esports stakeholders and see what is likely based on reputation theory analysis of, what they perceive Saudi Arabia to be doing and whether they think it's worth doing.
Perfect, great answer, Rory. It actually surprises me when you think about Saudi Arabia and the UK as comparisons, actually, where we move from a post-industrial to a more tourism and leisure-based activity with things like